We're here to talk about drugs, but I'm just going to start with a little kind of quiz. Who here, in the context of drugs, has heard of a thing called the British system? Like capital B, capital S, British system, formal thing. All right, for viewers at home, that's 0 people. And you guys are Google. I mean, you have access to information. But don't feel too bad, because I've asked the same question at criminology departments in major universities with people who specialize in drugs policy, and the results weren't actually that much better. It's a really interesting thing. So we started researching, we were researching drug policy for a long time together for another book, and we started researching the history of it. And what we uncovered was this really fascinating kind of like lost thread of British history. And we found it very revealing, not just about drugs and the way they're governed, but about the intellectual and political traditions of this country, and about how, like by reflection, the nature of global drugs policy and how it works, and more importantly, how it doesn't work. So, we're conscious of time. Give you a very quick, potted history of how drug policy developed, particularly in Britain. From the 19th century, the drugs that we consider illegal today were basically actually legal. You could buy them in apothecaries, corner stores. People brewed poppy head tea as a sort of folk remedy, a painkiller, in the absence of a health system, and aspirin hadn't been invented yet. As the 19th century ends, there's the emergence of a professional class, a new professional class of a pharmacist. This had never been heard before. Immediately what breaks out is a sort of turf war between two also newly emerging sets of professional classes. You have medical health professionals, which has been a newly professionalized industry, and you have civil servants and a newly emerging professional bureaucracy. And there's this little tussle between the two, and this happens all over the sort of developed world, as to who's going to control the supply of medicines, but also these illicit drugs like opium. Cannabis eventually became part of that conversation, and cocaine when it was invented. All three of which Queen Victoria was quite partial to, incidentally. So this tussle sort of goes on over the end of the 19th century as science advances, and then World War I happens. Post-World War I, the first British Ministry of Health is formed in 1919, and they figure, right, we need to figure this stuff out. Drugs are actually becoming an issue, on the international scene, particularly from the US, which we'll talk about in a minute. We need to figure this out. So they form a committee called the Rolleston Committee. The Rolleston Committee meets, and they basically figure out a system, which became known as the British system. And what the British system entailed in its most basic iteration was that if you are a heroin addict, and it was specifically largely about heroin, which is the most addictive drug, if you're addicted to heroin, you can go to your doctor and say, listen, I'm a heroin addict, and with no judgment, they'll say, okay, that's unfortunate, but we'll supply your heroin. We will give you heroin, not methadone, none of these other substitutes. We will supply you heroin from your doctor. You don't need to go to a gangster, you don't need to go to a black market. We'll give it to you. And what's very interesting about, that might be quite shocking that this happened sort of in living memory in this country. You go to your doctor and they give you drugs which we consider, evil or illegal. What's very interesting about the way the Rolleston Committee and the British system as it emerged is the language that was used. There was no moralizing. There was no sense that drugs were evil, or that taking drugs or being addicted to drugs was a moral failing. It was sort of referred to as these unfortunate people who are addicted to drugs. It was an accident. And this system was instituted, and it worked for decades. What's interesting is that there was another system emerging across the Atlantic in the United States, a different way of dealing with drugs, which was intensely moralizing, where drugs were considered a moral evil, and the only way with which to handle them was not through the medical profession, as it was under the British system, but by law enforcement. Which is, one can read many things into that about like American approaches between like the individual and the state, and like the sheriff with the badge and the gun and all this stuff, but another time. So the American way of dealing with these drugs was A, moralizing, and B, super racist. Like, it was rooted absolutely in racism, particularly in its real origins in anti-Chinese racism. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers had been brought to the United States to build the railroads. As soon as the railroads were finished, the establishment and the white America suddenly had to figure out, right, there are these hundreds of thousands of now unemployed Chinese people, and it became a problem for them. And attacking opium, the practice of taking opium, which had been largely forced on the Chinese by the British, again, another story, became a way to attack Chinese communities and to limit Chinese immigration. And there's some really, these quotes started flooding out from newspapers. This is a newspaper from San Francisco describing opium dens where white women and Chinamen sit side by side under the effects of this drug, a humiliating sight to anyone with anything left of manhood. And just stuff that you hear today and you go, yeah. The campaigner Richard Hobson, who was a major guy in the US incipient war on drugs, like the invasions and plagues of history, the scourge of narcotic drug addiction came out of Asia. Again, you hear that today and it's just profoundly disgusting, but this was the tenor of language at the time. Opium and eventually heroin was particularly associated with the Chinese community. Cocaine, they replicated it with cocaine in African Americans. There's quotes in the book, which I will not read now, which are profoundly disturbing. And marijuana with Mexicans and Hispanic Latin Americans community. It was a process which was repeated again and again to attach a certain drug to a certain ethnic community and use that to make the drug illegal as a way of attacking minorities. This resulted in a sort of early version of what we now call the war on drugs, and the American way of making all drugs illegal, which is, that idea didn't exist here. As I said, here we had the British system over here. In the States, they made everything illegal. Now, which system works better? If your aim is to control drug use, we can, and limit drug use and limit the dangers of drug use, we can look to the numbers. The exact numbers for, let's say, the 40s and 50s in America are sort of unknowable, but it's in the sort of mid to high hundreds of thousands, or low to mid hundreds of thousands.
In the US?
Several hundred thousand heroin addicts in the United States in the mid 40s, early 50s. In the United Kingdom, I'll read you a quote from the book. In 1959, there were 62 known heroin addicts in the UK. By 1964, this had risen to 342. Now, this 5-year rise from 62 to 342 heroin addicts here was considered a crisis here. It was like, oh my God, we have 350 heroin addicts in the entire country. You can compare the numbers. I remember going over these statistics and thinking, there was a time in living memory when the entire heroin addict population of the UK, it would be a bit of a squeeze, but it could fit in this room. That's in living memory, 1964. It's not that long ago. The Beatles' first LP had only come out 2 years earlier. So in terms of the effectiveness of controlling addict numbers, we see the British system was actually much more effective. There are very technical reasons for that, which I'd like to get into in a minute, but I'm going to let Neil get on in 1 second because I just want to keep it clipping along. Why did the British system get shut down? Essentially, the short answer is American, what we call cultural imperialism. The Second World War happens. Every single developed economy ends the Second World War poorer, except one, the United States. The United States ended the war richer. There are these very shocking quotes we found where in the aftermath of the war, as the incipient organization that grew into the United Nations comes about, the American organization which became the FBI, the predecessor to the FBI, sort of goes around the world and says, you want that military aid? Make drugs illegal. You want our political and diplomatic support? Make drugs illegal. And what we now know as the war on drugs was forced on through the United Nations, was forced on an unwilling rest of the world by United States diplomatic, military, and economic pressure. The major holdout, the major developed economy that resisted that was the United Kingdom. It's a surprise. We think of Anglo-American relations and we think of the UK following the US's lead a lot. It's a cliche. In fact, it's interestingly, in this particular field of policy, Britain was a resistor to that and led a really kind of noble diplomatic resistance. But I'm going to let Neil jump in to tell you how this, Neil has experienced the results of this on the streets, and I'll let him take over for a bit and tell you about his experiences.
Well, I mean, I grew up seeing the drug war as a war. So when I went into the police, I understood it, I thought, quite clearly. And as JS says, there was only a few hundred problematic heroin users in the UK in the 1960s. That went up to 350,000 by the end of the 1980s. So there's a very clear cause and effect there. But of course, that cause and effect, that's what brought me into the drug war. As a young police officer, I got an attachment to the drug squad. And because of the moral panic about crack and heroin on our streets. And I got roped into working undercover, and it was just beginning. This type of undercover work just began at that time in 1993 in the UK. And the first time I worked undercover, I was sent to a door with a £20 note to buy some crack cocaine. And the guy, this huge scary guy I thought, but then when he sold me the crack, he said, now you take care now, don't get arrested. He was quite considerate to me, really. And so I went back to the drug squad with my £20 stone of crack cocaine, said, I've got it. But then that defined the next 14 years of my life. And that's the work I then did for the most part, for the biggest proportion of that time, for 14 years. Now, I say it was easy the first time and he was quite considerate, but of course drug dealers get sent to prison and they speak to other drug dealers. So quite quickly they knew that there was a new tactic out there, and so the next people were more suspicious and it was more difficult. So I realised that I had to spend time manipulating people. I also worked out that the easiest people to manipulate are the most vulnerable. It's true. It's a truism of undercover work. You manipulate the most vulnerable people the easiest. And of course, the most vulnerable people are the most problematic heroin and crack cocaine users. And also, the most vulnerable people, they've got all the contacts as well, because they're using more drugs than anybody else. So I got to know the people who were self-medicating for childhood trauma. I spent time speaking to them. People who'd been abused, beaten by their fathers, sexually abused by their uncles, or neglected in one way or another. The people who are problematically using heroin tend to have those kind of things in common. So I spent a lot of time listening to them. One of these people, who had a very difficult childhood, I got to know in an undercover operation in Nottingham. He was called Cammy. Now I spent weeks wooing him. I even bought him presents. I said, oh, Cammy, I've been shoplifting this, and I didn't sell this last cap, I said to him. Shoplifting is great fun, by the way. If you've got your get out of jail free card and you know you can get away with it, really is, it's great fun. But I digress anyway. So I gave him this baseball cap, and I'll never forget the day he took his old one off, his tatty cap off, and he put his new one on, and checking out his profile in the glass doorway. And he says, oh, thanks, man, that's really great, thank you. Anyway, I spent a lot of time with Cammy, and he introduced me to the people that I needed to be introduced to, particularly some people who were involved with this gangster called Colin Gunn, who ran the Bestwood cartel in Nottingham. So he was the person who got me to the introductions. Now, At the conclusion of that operation, of course, Cammy had also been committing offences. In fact, he was committing offences on bail. He'd been dealing heroin himself. So he also got arrested. And I found out when all the people, there were 60-odd people arrested for that operation, and I found out that when he was in the police cells, he ended up on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch. And the reason for that is he thought I was his one friend in the world, the only person he could trust with the things that he was talking about. And of course, you know, I used my empathy to get to know him. I knew exactly what I was doing. But for him, for someone who'd had that difficult a childhood, that was just one betrayal too much. So when I finished that operation, I actually decided I had to stop working undercover, and I did for a few weeks, until I got a phone call from the detective sergeant, and he says, "Woodsy, we need you to do this job, because these guys are even more vicious than the last ones. This gang, the Burger Bar Boys, are using rape as reputation building, just to be the scariest gangsters out there. And they were taking over the supply of heroin and crack in the town of Northampton. They were a gang that was coming out of Birmingham. So I spent months, again, manipulating people in Northampton to get the introductions to them. And they were a terrifying bunch, the Burger Bar Boys. In fact, one day I had been wearing a camera, because eventually you have to have some kind of corroboration of what's going on. I had been wearing one, but one day I thought, I don't like the way they're looking at me. They're being a bit suspicious of me. So the next morning I thought, shall I wear the camera? And I didn't. I left it off. And wow, I was pleased that I did, because when I met them, they snatched me off the street into this big van, took me to the edge of the racecourse in the centre of Northampton, and one of them lifted her shirt up and showed me a gun and said, "Right, come on, strip. You're 5-0, man. You're 5-0. And yeah, they do. They use the word 5-0. I remember looking at them thinking, you're not old enough to have seen that programme on TV. 5-0? Anyway, they made me strip, which was a terrifying experience, especially with the gun there, and they crowded round me, laughing at me and trying to humiliate me, and it was humiliating. But I was still thinking, thank God I didn't wear the camera. But with all the horrors that they were doing and the casual violence that they dished out, eventually it dawned on me. You see, when I'd been manipulating Cammy and other people and causing harm to those people, I knew I'd caused the harm. I knew that their lives would be much worse for meeting me. But I thought the end justified the means. But eventually, after years and years of doing that work, it dawned on me that these gangsters were getting more and more violent every year. They weren't wishing me luck and telling me not to get myself arrested. They were threatening me with guns and knives and swords. And eventually I had the penny dropped, and I had to face the fact that the reason for that is down to me, or rather people like me. Because this drug war, if it's a war, it's more of an arms race. Because every tactic the police develop, organised crime develop a tactic to deal with it. And the best tactic organised crime have is the use of fear and violence. So it's a cause and effect again. It's like we've gone from a few hundred heroin addicts to 350,000. There's a cause and effect. By trying to police this problem, that's what we do. We cause the violence as the pushback. So that was hard for me, because all those times I took the decision that the end justified the means, it didn't. It didn't at all. All I've been doing is causing harm. But I think perhaps would you explain a bit better about how the arms race works?
Yeah, well, I can put it in context, I guess. So that process of an arms race that Neil saw, where the police get smarter, so the gangsters get more violent. So the police have to get smarter, and the gangsters have to get more violent. It's an ever-escalating arms race, and because of the particular nature of drug addiction in the drugs market, there's never any option of de-escalation. It can only go one way because of the structure of policy. Neil experienced that very, like, in a brutal sort of first-hand way on the street. When we were researching this book, essentially what we were trying to do, we realized, was to show the war on drugs not as a sort of process of like headline by headline by headline, sort of daily hysteria over drugs, but as a process of sort of change over time, and to see how actually over decades this has changed and it's grown and sort of metastasized into the crisis we see today. And we hung out with quite a few pretty heavy gangsters, interviewing them because they have an important view on this, the people who sell the drugs. And we were up in Liverpool, which occupies a very specific place in the sort of drugs map of the UK for various historical reasons. And we ended up interviewing 3 generations of Liverpool gangsters. The first one came up in the late 70s, early 80s. I think he was first arrested at 14 for robbery, got into very serious armed robbery. This was a scary guy. Neil, as a cop, and me as a journalist, have both interviewed some pretty heavy people in our careers, and both of us came out of this interview going, that guy was serious news. He was a big guy. He'd been shot 4 times, or 3 or 4 times, I forget. He had hands, you could see the damage from his hands from where he had damaged other people. And he described how he had come up in the armed robbery world of the 80s and seen the process by which the drugs crisis as it emerged in the 80s wiped out the armed robbers, or at least co-opted the armed robbers. And everyone became a drug dealer because there is just simply the risk to reward that you can make from dealing drugs far outweighs the risk to reward you can make from like having to actually take a gun, go to a bank, you might get shot by the police, and the amount of money you might make in one armed robbery, you can make week in, week out, selling heroin to vulnerable addicts without incurring the kind of risk that armed robbers do have. Now, interestingly, armed robbery actually sort of went up when the drugs crisis emerged because everyone was trying to, all the criminal world were trying to do an armed robbery in order to get the capital to invest in selling heroin. So it's bad from all angles. But what's interesting, as much as this guy used guns, he also talked about fighting a lot, like actually physical fist fighting to solve turf wars and stuff. The next guy was slightly less physically imposing, but sort of just as worrying a guy. He'd been a very serious gangster in the 90s. He'd come up with the ecstasy generation, the early rave scene, made a lot of money in that, and then diversified his portfolio into cocaine, heroin, and guns. It was very interesting. What he described as a process of sort of professionalization of this, as opposed to the sort of chaotic 70s and 80s world. He was like, no, what we did is we read the biographies of terrorists and figured out how to like divide our organization into like cellular structures so that if one guy got caught, he wouldn't be able to rat on the other guys. And it was this very interesting process of like almost like corporatization, professionalization, and the money was phenomenal. They came up. But he also said, like, yeah, and if we had a problem with the guy, we took him in the van, stuck a gun in his mouth, and told him not to come back. Or told him to stop what he was doing. And that was our thing. But I don't think this guy had ever, I know he'd never been shot, and I don't think he'd ever actually shot anybody. But the threat, and people he knew had certainly shot other people. The third person we spoke to was 16 years old. And he'd been dealing drugs since he was 13 and carrying a knife since he was 13. He had stopped dealing drugs, he said, about 6 months before we sat down to talk. But he had grown up in a world where that was normal. And he described the sort of the chaos of the current scene. The monopolization, which I described before from the 90s heavy gangster, had been sort of smashed up a bit by the police. They'd had certain successes. And what that had led to is a sort of fragmentation of the drug world, where the guys at the very top are still corporate and monopolized, but the people at the low end, this 16-year-old kid, there's a chaotic element to it, which it makes it harder for the police to catch. This kid described one situation where he had, at 15 years old, he'd had a beef with another couple of 15-year-olds. They'd come looking for him. They hadn't been able to find him, so they kicked in the door of his house and slashed his father across the face with a knife, 15. This kid, Alex, the kid, 15-year-old we were talking to, he went to the boss of his immediate boss in his drug dealing organization, who was in his mid-20s, and said, look, these kids have slashed my father across the face. I need a gun. His boss said, you know what, I've just sold my last gun, but I've got a hand grenade. So this 15-year-old kid sat with the hand grenade in his sock drawer for 6 months, trying to find the other kids. He wasn't able to find them because they were off doing something called county lines, which Neil's about to describe. So he eventually sold the hand grenade off. What's interesting about this is what we describe in the book is it's a process of 3 generations, that the British drug war is now in its 3rd generation. You have the generation where drugs sort of came up, where the armed robbers became drug dealers. You have the generation of monopolization and corporatization, when the money flooded in and the drug gangs became organized and made a lot of money. And now you have this 3rd generation of kids on the street who have only been socialized in the norms of the drug war. And for them, these are kids like this 16-year-old who we interviewed. This is normal. This is what it is. It's a process that gets worse over time. The arms race that Neil describes experiencing personally, this is how it plays out over a process of decades. And what's interesting is these 2 hard gangsters, the guy who'd been shot 3 times and the Mr. Gun in the mouth, they looked at the 14, 15-year-olds who they knew on the street now and were like, whoa. I mean, we did some stuff, but these kids now, they're crazy. They looked on with horror and fear, like real fear about what the process, the arms race had produced. We asked the kid, the 16-year-old, how long would it take for you right now to get us a gun if we wanted one? He said about 2 hours, maybe an afternoon, a whole afternoon, maybe. We asked the older guy, the 70s guy, who had literally been shot several times, how would you have gone about getting a gun in your day? He said, well, what I would have had to have done is go to one of the older gangsters, one of the older heads, and been like, look, I've got a beef, I need a gun. And they would have said, you're not having a gun. If you shoot somebody, you'll bring the heat on us, you'll bring the cops down on us. If you have a problem with a guy, go knock the hell out of each other a bit and sort it out. But don't bring the police involved. Don't get the police involved. And the way that the older gangsters talked about the kids today, it was actually genuinely terrifying, genuinely chilling. And for a window into the sort of emerging dystopia of what the future holds if we proceed with the same policies, I'll let Neil jump in.
Okay, yeah. So we talked about county lines. Has everyone heard of county lines drug dealing? So in the UK, county lines drug dealing is children being involved in the supply of heroin and crack. It's primarily those 2 drugs, but there's some other drugs as well. And it's basically about expanding monopolies, inner city gangs wanting to take over the businesses of other towns. So for anyone watching this from America, it's about the United Kingdom finally catching up with the amount of children exploited in America for drug dealing, because it's a sort of inevitability. I say it's inevitable though, but actually when I look at county lines and what's happening, that's my fault. Because when I caught the Burger Bar boys, they were adults who were taking over the drug supply in one town from the larger city, but they were doing it themselves. They were hands-on, they were doing the dealing, they were carrying the money, they were stashing the money and transporting it all themselves. But successes like mine and other police successes have meant that the natural strategic response to that police success is to start using children, and that's what's happened. It's a logical step. This is what success looks like. You see, police are really, really good at catching drug dealers. They're brilliant at it. The world, all across the world they are. If you give UK police twice the resources, they can catch twice the drug dealers. It's true. But police never reduce the size of the market. Never. If you catch a burglar, burglaries will go down because there's a limited amount of people willing to commit that crime. If you catch a drug dealer, you create an opportunity for somebody else. And often you create the violence because then there's competition for that opportunity. And there's nothing the police can do about that. So the harder you try, the worse things get. So the children dealing in county lines, that's caused by trying to police drugs. So we now have, we've talked about the British system and heroin being controlled by the prescription pad. It's now being controlled by, as we've heard, 15-year-olds with hand grenades. This is the reality on the streets, and it can only go in one direction. But there's something else I need to explain to you all. Again, for the British audience, has everyone been watching Line of Duty, or you know about it? Yeah. Well, for the Americans, it's a cop show which exposes, it's a drama which exposes corruption, which some people think is far-fetched. Well, let me tell you, it's not necessarily far-fetched, certainly not the corruption. If I go back to Cammy's story in Nottingham, the person he introduced me to was a rather vicious guy called Stitz. He interrogated me with a knife pressed into my groin. It was a terrifying experience, but he got me closer to the gangster that I wanted to get. I didn't actually get the gangster I wanted. That took another operation, but a few months later, Colin Gunn was caught, the head of the Bestwood cartel in Northampton, a brilliant operation by Nottinghamshire police. But at the time that I was introduced to that guy Stitz, 2 of my backup team went off sick. And so 2 new police officers were brought in that I didn't know. The first one of those, I shook his hand, it was fine. The second one, I shook his hand, and the hairs went up at the back of my neck. Instinctively, everything about this guy screamed wrong. Now, when you've been working, at that point I've been working that job for 4.5 months. When you're working undercover, your senses tend to be fairly fine-tuned. And I was picking up on just some nuance of body language that made me very unhappy. So I spoke to the guy running the operation and said, "Boss, I cannot have this guy knowing what I'm doing. I do not trust him." So they were both excluded to save them asking any questions, and they didn't know what I did that day. It turns out, when Colin Gunn was arrested, that this police officer, a guy called Charlie Fletcher, was an employee of Colin Gunn. Not just a corrupt cop, he'd been paid to join the police. Paid to join the police. By the time I met him, he'd been in the police for 7 years. He was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. I was quite shocked. Even though I'd come across corruption many times, it was still unsettling. But senior police said to me, "Woodsy, of course this happens. We know this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen?" See, I say that police are good at catching dealers. They are. But by arresting lots of dealers, what you do is you thin out the competition and help the monopolisation. So the gangsters who are at the top of the tree, they love the police taking out the competition because their part of their empire grows. And where you concentrate the wealth into fewer hands, you make corruption more possible because there's greater wealth to do it. And let me make something perfectly clear. The only form of criminality that can pay for that level of corruption is the illicit drugs market. There's no other form of criminality that can corrupt our police and criminal justice system like that. £10 billion a year, the value of the UK illicit drugs market. That's a lot of money that can corrupt the system. But it is the mechanism of policing it that creates the monopolies that allows that corruption to happen. In the book, I mean, I've come across corruption many times. But in the book, we interviewed someone called Frank Matthews, who used to be a supervisor of people who went into the witness protection system. So the witness protection system is in itself a creation of the drug war. Because until we had the drug war, witnesses were not too scared to give evidence. But such are the stakes and the value in the market that the whole system has been corrupted. So if someone wants to give out evidence against the leading gangster in an inner city, that gangster has all the tools that they need to try and intimidate that witness to prevent them from giving evidence. So the witness protection system is born. So if someone, perhaps to avoid a chunk of jail sentence themselves, is willing to give evidence against an organised crime group, they are given a new identity. They're never allowed to see their family again or friends. They go to the other end of the country, they're given a new name and everything. So there are people who don't exist out there. But what shocked us is what Frank Matthews was able to tell us, because he used to work within that, is that even that last defence against organised crime, the witness protection system, even that is corrupted. We were able to show that with evidence from Frank Matthews in the book. He was a whistleblower from the Metropolitan Police. Frank is not his real name. He had to have a false identity himself. And you know, Frank spent a career fighting the highest echelons of organised crime. But the first time he felt that his life was truly in danger was when he was grassing up corrupt cops. That's when he assumed there was a hit on his life, when he was most at risk. So I hope we've established the cause and effect here. And I hope we've established what direction this is going in as each generation goes on. For every year, decade that this drug war is entrenched in our policy, it's only going in one direction. And if you look around the world, you know, the monopolisation effect doesn't just happen in the UK, it happens in other countries as well. Look at how Mexico goes at war between the cartels go to war with each other, and then eventually someone has dominance and the monopoly takes over. The biggest violence increases are when someone's actually caught, like anywhere in the world. But you know, in Mexico, the detection rate of murders, the rate where a murder is solved, is less than 1%. And that's because you're as likely to be killed by one of the police officers as you are anybody else, because they tend to work for the cartels. The corruption is spreading across the world. You now have narco states in West Africa, just where the production, the transport of drugs happens, because they have low economies and they are easily corrupted. This corruption is spreading, and it is inevitable until we take control of drugs by regulating them. So I'm part of an organisation, an international organisation, called the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. It started in the United States, which I think is fair enough because they lumbered us with this drug war in the first place. In America, we have prosecutors, chiefs of police, lots of former senior police officers. In the UK, we have former chief constables, former MI5, lots of other former undercover cops like me, and we're growing rapidly. We've just registered LEAP Europe in Paris. Last year, we launched LEAP Scandinavia. And thank you for the introduction earlier on, Chris. We slightly changed our name since you've introduced us. We used to be against prohibition. We still are, but we just have a better name. So we're the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. So anyone watching from America, please support LEAP as much as you can. And in UK, it's much the same. So I'm going to see now from JS if I've missed anything, or to sum up for us.
No, I think let's open it up for questions.
Yeah.
We'll have a chat.
Does the political influence from the US that you mentioned that started this whole demise of the British system after the World War II, does that still exist today? Is our drug policy still influenced by what the US wants?
Yeah, well, the US influence reached its pinnacle, and a fairly indelible pinnacle, in 1961 with a treaty, the United Nations Conventions on Narcotic Drugs. And that was a treaty that everyone had to sign up to, really. They'd spent a couple of decades winning everybody round to do that. And it's interesting that that single treaty in the United Nations, which forces everyone to follow the prohibition model, according to the United States doctrine, how it's described in the United Nations, drugs are described as evil. It's the only United Nations treaty which uses that word. Genocide, they don't use the word evil. So genocide's not evil, but drugs are. So you can see that even in the writing of the treaty, that sort of moral judgment's written into it. So each individual nation state is actually quite limited according to international law in how they shape their own drug policy. It actually restricts innovation now. But that's starting to break down because in 2001, Portugal, which the United Nations said at the time they were breaching the treaty, Portugal decriminalised drugs. It's not a perfect system because organised crime still controls the supply, so they still have the same level of corruption. But people don't go to jail for using drugs, and whereas they used to have more deaths than us, now, whereas we have 50 deaths per million, they now have 3 deaths per million. So you can see that a health-based approach helps. But there are, of course, bigger breaches of that treaty by the United States themselves. They have several states which legally regulated cannabis for adult use. So they've broken the treaty, which really, so it's the United States which has opened the floodgates. That means everything's on the table. The rules have already been broken. Canada has just legally regulated cannabis for adult use right across the whole country. So they've gone even farther than the United States. Obviously, Uruguay does the same. Switzerland prescribes heroin like we used to do, and as a result, they've cut burglaries in half and saved countless lives. So there are examples of good drug policy which is coming now. It's almost like we're starting to try cast off those shackles of the United Nations Single Convention in 1961.
There's an argument that the privatisation of the prison systems across the US has actually resulted in higher levels of incarceration. Is that a similar system you think is now playing out in the UK as we adopt a similar model? And do you think that's actually one of the driving forces behind the laws not changing?
I think you should. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a different type of corruption in America as well, and that is corporate corruption, and the influence of both the financing behind private prisons and also actually the prison officers' unions put great pressure on politicians to not change the drug laws. And the reason for that is America has only 5% of the world's population. They have almost a quarter of the world's prison population. 1 in 3 black families have a male parent in prison. I mean, this is absolutely extraordinary. From the redeclaration of the war on drugs from Reagan, at that time they had around 200,000 people in prison. Now they have 2.2 million. And that's an incredible increase, and it's all about the war on drugs. And it's made things worse because they have the highest opioid problem in the world. They have the biggest drug deaths. It's causing carnage. There is another cause and effect there. So to answer your question, there is a huge political influence in lobbying in the USA, and it is one of the many stumbling blocks to reform in the United States. But as to the question in the UK, no, we don't have that excuse. I think our private prisons have actually reduced in the last few years. There was one closed. I think there's only 7 actually. And of course, the way that the system works in the United Kingdom, there are limits to what financial lobbying can be done. So you're not going to have quite the same influence on politicians, financial influence. So we don't have the same excuse, really. Our politicians don't, I would say.
Sorry, can I just jump in and say there is an absolute indelible connection between the war on drugs and not the prison industrial complex that they have in the States, but there is a massive crisis in UK prisons right now. And it's worth remembering that over 50% of prisoners in the UK are there for drug-related offences. So you get occasional commentators across the media, I will not mention names, but who say, well, the war on drugs has never really been fought in the UK. It's an absurdity because over 50% of the prison population is there for drug-related offences. There was a report just the other day, I think just 2 days ago, about a new unit, a special unit that has been formed to combat police officers sneaking drugs into prisons. There's a drug crisis inside prisons. We can't keep drugs out of prisons. How are we going to keep them out of society? If you come from Neil, with the reading that Neil and I have done, you say, oh, there's a new unit to combat corruption in the among prison guards. I give it 3 weeks before that unit is corrupted too. So and that is like you said, is the unique to the war to drugs prohibition policing, is that creating a market which can corrupt the institutions which are meant to combat it on that level. And it's absolutely unique to war on drugs.
Given America obviously tried prohibition with alcohol and it failed pretty badly, did you have any insight into why, therefore, there was such a drive to try not only prohibition within the States but outside of the States with drugs? Because it seems it's an odd lesson to take from how they tried prohibition with alcohol.
Interestingly, the prohibition of drugs precedes prohibition of alcohol. So the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was 1914, which is what made drugs we now consider illegal inside the United States. Interestingly, this is my geeky historian. The first American prohibition regime wasn't instituted in the United States. It was instituted in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, when America took over the Philippines, and it was an extension of that racist impulse and discourse in the US that, well, there are Asian people doing these drugs, we have to clamp down on it. So it was sort of, when we describe the war on drugs as a process of American imperialism, cultural imperialism, and just imperialism, it's actually, if you look at the history of this and how it grew, it's quite literal. It was literally a process of when America became an imperial power and had colonies beyond its own borders, it instituted drug prohibition regimes then. The campaigners within the United States, they tried to institute it on the world stage internationally before they banned drugs in America. And of course the rest of the world went, well, we're not banning drugs. You don't even ban drugs inside America. And it was mainly the British saying that. And so the Americans went, oh, right, well, we better prohibit drugs in America so that we can then export it to the rest of the world. And that's the process by which it happened. So yeah, no lessons were learned.
Yeah, absolutely. And another lesson, which of course should have been learned from alcohol prohibition, is that actually there are various reasons why it came to an end, but the most important reason is the public realised just how much it was corrupting the police. So when you hear that Eliot Ness and the Untouchables, the reason that he was called the Untouchables is because the press mocked him, because he did an interview and says, well, my team are untouchable. So the press had the front pages the next day saying, finally, we've found some cops which are untouchable. So there's only 12 of them. And that's how he got the nickname. And it was that knowledge of the corruption, what it was doing to the system, which actually turned public opinion against it, which is why it's so important to realise just the level of corruption. And of course, it's really difficult to highlight the corruption because the Home Office instructs chief constables to maintain public confidence. Of course, that's important. If you lose confidence in the police, then the fabric of society could break down, etc. Well, I've got news for you, Home Office. The fabric of society is breaking down, and people are losing confidence because we're not being honest, and we're not actually dealing with the problems that exist. So yeah, please, wish more people had studied what happened in the 1920s in America.
If you had a magic wand, what would be your first policy, and what do you think would have the biggest impact?
Oh, well, that's easy, and it's easy for all reasons, because it's already legal, the policy's already there, we wouldn't have to change any law whatsoever. You prescribe heroin liberally to those people that need it, so you go back to the British system. You do that, overnight, 80% of the market for county lines drug dealing, where children are exploited, would disappear completely, because that's mostly about heroin. The crime that the hardcore of those people who are having a problem with heroin commit disappears overnight. Shoplifting stops. It sounds easy. Well, it is. It's in our history. It's there. Okay, it's a bigger scale problem now. We're talking 200,000 plus people. But if you've got to start taking care of people, not everybody would need to keep on a heroin prescription. Many people would find the stability in their life to move on to then another kind of treatment. But if you invest in the treatment, even a fraction of what is spent on law enforcement, a fraction, you would tackle the problem that law enforcement cannot do. And taking care of people's cheaper than treating them as criminals, like significantly. So that's the first thing I'd do. Then you can start breaking all the other drugs into the individual regulatory needs that those drugs have, because they do have different regulatory needs. You know, cannabis, you have to decide what strength product, what type of product can be sold to whom and where can it be used. It's much like alcohol, really, but we can do better than we did with alcohol, because we can ban advertising straight away. We can take out those kind of commercial elements and base it on a health-based approach. For MDMA, for example, MDMA is not prohibited because it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it's prohibited. People are dying because that's unregulated product. You pick any death of the last few years and look at what's caused it. It's been caused because it wasn't MDMA that they bought, or it's 4 times too strong. Regulation will save lives and reduce harm.
Sorry, what's MDMA?
MDMA is ecstasy.
Oh.
You know, in British summer, there might be 1 million people dancing in a field on MDMA. Are they deviant, or do they just like to dance in a field with the help of a certain stimulant? And if you agree with me, then you're part of the social movement, and please start passing on this information to other people, because that's how we win. You know, we speak to a lot of politicians between us, a great deal, and it's good to try and influence politicians, but you're more important because you're part of the social movement.
Yes, so given the relaxation of the US policy with regards to marijuana, do you see, or what do you see as the biggest obstacle internally to changes that you described in UK drug policy?
The biggest obstacles in the UK? Oh, there's a few.
It's a really interesting, complex question, because it's really multifaceted, isn't it?
I'd say,
I mean, inertia would be a massive one.
Would you? Is there an argument that actually journalism is the biggest?
Well, I was going to save that, but yeah.
Okay.
My profession are a massive problem. It's like massive problem. I read out some quotes before of these racist quotes from the early 20th century in the US, and everyone in the room just winced. Just went. And I've done these events before, and I've gone much further, and I've read out quote after quote after quote, and there's this cringe that people go, people actually wrote that. Addressing my profession, the members of the media, journalists and editors who are writing today, right now, in 25 years, maybe sooner, maybe 10 years, we will look back on how drug users are described today with the same cringe that we today look back at the racist language used to describe drug users and people who didn't use drugs, just ethnic minorities, in the early 20th century. And I warn journalists and I warn editors of that a lot, because the way, when people talk about spice zombies, it's the dehumanization of people who use drugs in the media, especially the tabloid media. It's a huge toxic problem. And the tabloid media has a particular, because of the media landscape in the UK, it's particularly strong. It has a particular weight here. And politicians are particularly scared of crossing it. Politicians are trailing public opinion at this point. But the media has a huge toxic role in that.
Do you think that organised crime is successfully lobbying through corruption to resist reform? Like, are they, corrupting or pouring money into resisting this societal change?
I would say that's inevitable because of the very highest echelons of organised crime and international cartels. There is a very thin and blurry line between genuine business and the money of the drugs markets, because the drugs markets money makes the world go round. You only have to look at the scandal with HSBC a few years ago. They were seen to be laundering huge amounts of money from the illicit drugs market, and no one was prosecuted. No one was. It wasn't even seriously considered. So there is an obvious interconnection, because where money meets money at the top of the pyramid. But what I would say is, as we move forward, and we will move forward because there is lots of innovations happening across the world, that influence will become stronger, because where big business of any kind finds itself threatened, whether it's the oil lobby in America, paying politicians, the same kind of thing will happen, and it will be very difficult to spot, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to drug dealers, and I've explained my position on it. And they say, expletive, 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 you're going to do me out of a job. The drug dealers on a big scale, high-level gangsters, are far more scared of the reform movement than they are of the cops.
Absolutely.
We will do much more damage to murderous, bloody cartels across Latin America than the police there will. It's much more of a threat.
Yeah.
Because we're not pro-cartel. They do bad things. They're awful. The threat to them is through a regulated model, not through continuing a failed system, which is going to create even more dystopian outcomes 20 years down the line.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. Thanks.